फॉर एग्जाम्पल एक तो उन्होंने बात ये की कि जब आप HEC के चेयरपर्सन बने थे तो आपके सिर्फ 4 पेपर थे, ये बात उन्होंने लिखी हुई है, राइट?
For example, there's a business degree graduate can set up a business in Pakistan. Does our degree prepare student for that?
Crediting some works and not crediting others, right? तो उस तरह से वो फिर वो 4 का जो नंबर उन्होंने पता नहीं निकाला है, मुझे नहीं, मेरे साथ नहीं शेयर किया.
फीमेस पॉडकास्ट की सीजन 2 में ये एपिसोड नंबर 9 है और आज हमारे जो गेस्ट हैं वो एक दफ़ा फिर डॉक्टर तारिक बनूरी हैं जो कि इस वक्त HEC के चेयरपर्सन हैं और डेवलपमेंट इकोनॉमिस्ट हैं और उसके एजुकेशनिस्ट हैं.
थोड़ा सा इंट्रोडक्शन हमारे बारे में. मैं जिनार हूँ और मेरा ताल्लुक सिरैक्यूज़ यूनिवर्सिटी से फिलहाल, और मैं फुल ब्राइट स्कॉलर हूँ, 4th ईयर Ph.D स्टूडेंट हूँ इन एजुकेशन, और मैं इंटरेस्ट हायर एजुकेशन में. हसन जो है वो ऑल्बनी यूनिवर्सिटी में होते हैं, स्टेट यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ न्यूयॉर्क ऑल्बनी. That's right, Hassan? And he is also a PhD student, physics में PhD कर रहे हैं. And we are really glad to have you here. So sir, start करते हैं. आपकी reinstatement से पहले हमने एक podcast किया था और हम बैठे थे ऐसे ही मिलके और बातचीत हुई थी. So interesting breakthroughs since then. How has your work been with HEC and since you have been reinstated?
Well, the thing is that people who are against, shall we say, some of the agenda that I and others like me have put forward, they have been planning for a while with the support of the present government, but also on their own. So one of the things they had done was to try to figure out a way to delay matters as much as they could. We could see that in the courts that they were trying to delay the hearings, every time asking for deferment and seeking various kinds of tactics for delays. Ultimately, when we also heard, by the way, that they had gotten the government to prepare a third ordinance. They needed 2 ordinances to get rid of me, and then they were afraid that the court might rule in my favor, which made sense given the weight of evidence on our side. But they had prepared a third ordinance in case I was reinstated, in which the powers of the chairman would get taken away. So, ordinance, luckily, they were advised not to put that into the process. I think that would probably have irritated the court because they could see the malafide being worked out. But in the meantime, they got other things. They got 4 additional members placed on the commission, and they also got some of their people placed in strategic positions within the HEC in the staff. So since I took over, they've been using this kind of a coalition to try to stop me from doing anything meaningful, in particular restarting the auditing and the evaluation exercise that we had basically put together by the time that I was removed. So this has basically meant that rather than give attention to issues of education and issues of quality, a lot of the energy and effort has been going into dealing with this conspiracy. And that is rather unfortunate. I think it is part of their own strategy to somehow or the other delay matters and not allow things to get done. So HEC, has become a bit of a it's in a state of paralysis almost, right? Because the weight of opinion and the quality staff and members do seem to support the agenda that I have advanced. But the others also are now in somewhat strategic position. So we are kind of fighting a little bit of a battle there. As a result of that, some members of civil society have gone into another petition before the High Court, and that will come up for hearing on Monday. And the purpose of that petition is, number one, that they've tried to use the commission to try to stop me from functioning. So number one is to invalidate some of the actions that they have taken illegal. And number two, also to remove the people who were appointed illegally and without due process, and also who do not seem to have the credentials to be appointed to the commission. So in दोनों चीजों के ऊपर the cases before the High Court. But the situation now is that there is really their gloves have come off. From our side, I don't think that we are kind of the people who want to take the law in our own hands, but we have to defend ourselves as much as we can. And luckily, we feel that the good arguments and the evidence is on our side, so we can rely on the courts to take the right action. So that's where we are.
Mm-hmm. So how many people have been appointed in your absence, and on what positions, even if you can talk on a high level status and not specific people?
So they got one gentleman who was under a cloud and was being investigated, namely Mr. Atta-ur-Rehman, to get him appointed to the commission as a commission member. In addition to that, and that was done in a manner which just reeks of malafide. I mean, it was done post haste. It was rammed down people's throats. People objected. There were high court rulings. They were overruled. Not overruled, sidelined and bypassed. So that we think is likely to go forward. We'll see how the court rules on it. Then in addition to that, they got the size of the commission expanded. Again, there were no reasons for it except that they wanted a majority of the commission. So they got 3 persons appointed out of the blue. All 3 happened to be very close to Atta-ur-Rehman. So they basically got a block of 4 seats in the private members of the commission, plus orders were issued to the government representatives to basically toe the line that Atta-ur-Rehman represents, with the result that that has given them a nominal majority of the commission. So I think we have basically approached the court to say that all of these appointments are illegal. And of course, the government, if the government officials take orders not from the legally appointed persons, but from an external private person who just happens to be close to the government, that also is illegal. In the event, I mean, one thing that you should also know is that the court, High Court ruling, I don't know that whether the detailed judgment of the High Court has been circulated, but I'll send it to you. But one of the things they said is that that they were mindful of the fact that Atta-ur-Rehman has managed to interfere actively in HEC matters in order to protect himself from evaluation. And they basically directed the Prime Minister to request HEC, number one, to take an audit of all of the projects that are associated with him. Number two, they said that it should be ensured. Well, number two, they said that the Prime Minister should actively try to dispel the impression that has been created that all this has been done in order to favor one particular individual, the same individual. And number three, they said that the Prime Minister should ensure that Atta-ur-Rehman does not interfere with or in any other way has anything to do with HEC affairs. Now that this direction of the court has been circulated to the staff and to the members of the commission, and yet we received report about massive interference continuing to take place. That is, number one, both subject to contempt of court proceedings, but more importantly, it is a form of corruption. If a public servant takes orders from a private individual in the discharge of his or her duties, it's a form of corruption, and it's a crime, and can also be subject to disciplinary proceedings. So we are looking at all of those options also. So that's where we are.
ठीक। अच्छा सर, वैसे आपने अपने अभी तक जो क्वेश्चन थे उनमें कुछ हद तक बात की है इसकी, लेकिन अगर आपको थोड़ी और डिटेल में बात करनी है उस पर तो आप कर सकते हैं। और अगर इस क्वेश्चन के आंसर में मैं पूछना लगूँ, अगर आपको लगता है कि कोई पर्टिकुलर मैटर सब जुडिस में बात नहीं करनी चाहिए, तो यू कैन स्टे साइलेंट ऑन दैट। तो क्वेश्चन मेरा ये है कि हमने ये पढ़ा है काफ़ी आर्टिकल्स में, डॉक्टर आयशा ने भी आर्टिकल्स लिखे हैं, उसके अलावा और भी लोगों ने, कि आपसे कुछ अथॉरिटी जो है वो स्ट्रिप की गई है एज ए चेयरपर्सन, ठीक है, और आपको जो मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ फेडरल एजुकेशन एंड प्रैक्टिकल ट्रेनिंग इसके अंडर लाने की कोशिश की जा रही है। एक तो ये क्वेश्चन है। दूसरा क्वेश्चन जो इससे थोड़ा सा रिलेटेड है वो ये है कि हमें अच्छे से पता है कि आजकल ये जो प्रेजेंट गवर्नमेंट है ये आई थिंक शायद चली जाए कुछ दिनों में, तो आपको लगता है कि इसके जाने से कोई फर्क पड़ेगा इस केस के ऊपर, या आपको लगता है कि नहीं?
On the first question, as I mentioned, that they did manage to get some people illegally appointed to the commission, so they passed a so-called resolution without any due process, without a meeting, completely illegally and malafide, to claim that they have transferred the powers of the chairman to the executive director. Kyunki executive director inki appointee. That is completely illegal and without any kind of a warrant. So we have now a kind of an impasse, because I just ignore it, and they try to do whatever they can, and if it is something particularly egregious, I make an effort to stop it. कुछ 3-4 चीजें उन्होंने बहुत गलत करने की कोशिश की, so that I succeeded in stopping. But it's unless we have a kind of a pitched battle, it's going to be the same impasse, and we would like the courts to intervene. They had, as I mentioned, there was a time last year when they had prepared a third ordinance in which the purpose was essentially to get rid of the HEC and to place it as a kind of an attached department of the Ministry of Education, so that people who were thus inclined could probably take control of it. That fortunately they did not pursue it. So this idea that it is being placed under the ministry is not correct. And of course, if there is a change in government, I think we will be able to reverse the matters quite rapidly. Now, whether or not there's a change in government, that is not something that you and I can see. We'll find out tomorrow what happens. And that, of course, there are battles being fought over other things. In this case, a lot of the problems that have been arisen is because one person has tried to interfere massively in HEC affairs, largely to protect his personal interest. And it is unlikely that the same person would have the same kind of a clout in any other government. In fact, even in this government, most of the people, including ministers, were not really in favor of acceding to his wishes, but somehow or the other, they could not prevail, and there seems to have been an internal power struggle. But I don't think that all of this will spill over into any new government that takes place. But we will see. I mean, when a new government comes in, we'll see, and we'll deal with them, basically on the basis of a fresh platform. Right? My own attitude about it is, you basically deal with people in good faith unless they prove otherwise. Even with this government, my attitude all along was to deal with them on good faith. It's only when matters persistently proved otherwise that we had to begin to take some actions.
सर, आपने कुछ इंडिकेट किया कि कुछ एक्शंस आपने स्टॉप करने की कोशिश की. क्या आप डिटेल्स शेयर कर सकते हैं कि किस तरह के एक्शंस जो है वो लिए जा रहे थे और क्या स्टॉप करने की आपने कोशिश की?
देखिए, इस वक्त 3-4 चीजें बहुत वो है. एक तो ये है कि We had a number of funded projects, one with the World Bank, one with USAID, which were focused really on quality and accountability and setting up the systems, etc. Now, those two words seem to be a source of great discomfort to some small groups in both in academia and elsewhere. So they were sort of taking a lot of effort in trying to undermine, subvert those projects. Unless this kind of a blight is lifted from the HEC, I think we will have to continue to fight them. But at the meantime, if they try to do something particularly egregious, I did stop them. So, I mean, it's not only this. I mean, there are a number of other areas in which they've done problems. They've created problems. Then they've been very active in trying to pack both the commission and also the staff with unsuitable people. And so some of the people had been promoted in my absence. That we will take another fresh look at it. I mean, there will probably be some who are genuinely deserving to be promoted. Others were probably not sufficiently deserving and promoted simply because they were doing the bidding of some person. So we have started reviewing those, and we will take actions when the time comes. A number of people were being fired or let go, wherever we felt that action needs to be taken alacritiously, there we did. The good people who had some competence, were essentially being eased out in order to favor their own class of people. Then they had started some fresh recruitment proceedings. And when we look at the record of their recruitment efforts in the past, they were extremely problematic, because now we are in a situation where the majority of the senior people at HEC lack competence in matters related to education or research. And that has basically hampered the functioning of the institution as a quality promoter. So I basically try to slow it down until it could come under proper scrutiny, and therefore proper actions could be taken. So इस type के काम कर रहे हैं. Then there were also some things which were being done in regard to research projects which were being given to favorites. There were also some things in which data were being miscalculated in order to favor some people who were applying for jobs in the rest of academia. So before I came in, I found that some data had been cooked up in order to favor particular individuals and harm others. So unke upar phir maine ek review bithaya aur unko okay. So I mean, you see, when corrupt people try to get their claws into an organization, they create a lot of mess, and also they try to create sort of a kind of a viral syndrome in which people like themselves begin to gravitate towards them, and all that entire process has to be undone. So it's what, though, at this moment, I think we can only do a little bit, because we have to fight with them, we have to fight with the government. Also, we have to do whatever needs to be done, or whatever is urgently needed on the education front. But once if the court rules in our favor, I think then the situation will become clearer, and then we'll be able to take more strong and concerted action. But it's a rather unfortunate statement, both about the nature of governance in the country in general and about the last few years in particular.
Yeah. Sir, एक बंदा है पूरा माफिया है. It's just so difficult to see like how one person is influencing policy and governance at such a massive level and बिल्कुल negatively influence करने की कोशिश. And इतना ज़्यादा power एक बंदे के hands में होना, it's so weird and difficult. I don't know how other agencies, parallel agencies, I know HEC like has provincial partners, and then has some government bodies that help HEC achieve its mission. How they are reacting to it? Are they also thinking about the same things, or are they also joining hands with the other party and making it a party game rather than making it something focused towards the quality of education?
Well, you see, I mean, the way Mafias work is through patron-client relationships. So for the last 20 years, some people have been kind of developing this extensive patron-client networks, which means support, people sort of regardless of merit, support your loyalists regardless of merit, not only sort of promote them within the education system, but get them appointed to key positions. And so then you create a network which sort of controls a lot of the key areas. And of course, that has happened in a number of domains. So when you look at a number of faculty positions in universities, some vice-chancellors, some deans, professors are very much a part of that mafia. And then even in HEC, people were recruited very early on, 20 years ago. Now, 20 years later, when you look at their academic record, is rather mediocre, but, and subsequently also, there's not much to show for it, but nevertheless, they are now in positions of authority. And also in the 1 year that I was gone, the worst people who would, or some of them, I mean, some of the good people also got favored, but the worst people got favored and put into very, very strategic positions. Now, they would really never have been promoted under any merit-based system, and they knew it. So, so you end up creating a class which not only has no interest in merit, they are actively and vehemently opposed to it because they see their own interest lying with a kind of a mafia-type relationship, a patron-client relationship. So, so you create an environment like this.
Okay.
When I took over, this was not lost upon me. People did warn me. My attitude was that, we'll basically get some good people and start getting done the work that really is needed, right? So, fixing the research program, the funding program, fixing the curriculums and the quality metrics, right? So we got these things started under the radar, as it were. And, this somehow or the other, because the mafia has no interest in quality, they just did not really understand that this was going on. It's only in the last few months that they began to sort of react to it in a more aggressive manner. And so then they sort of began to try to take on some of the more practical things. But they haven't been able to undo them properly. And so as soon as we get rid of this blight, I think we'll be able to pursue that agenda much more aggressively. Gigi, sorry.
कोई मसला नहीं है सर। अच्छा, मेरा एक क्वेश्चन है केपी यूनिवर्सिटीज के बारे में। अच्छा, ये क्वेश्चन थोड़ा सा ना मुझे बैकग्राउंड देने की जरूरत है, इसके लिए तो थोड़ा सा शायद लेंथी होगा। तो मुझे ना 2020 में ये इस माफिया के बारे में और जिस पर्टिकुलर पर्सन की हम बात करें, डॉक्टर अता-उर-रहमान के बारे में, उनका उस बारे में पता नहीं था ज़्यादा। तो मैंने ना 2020 में एक पॉडकास्ट उनके साथ भी किया था, डॉक्टर अता-उर-रहमान के साथ। तो उन्होंने मुझे एक कहानी सुनाई थी। उन्होंने कहा था कि केपी यूनिवर्सिटीज़ में एक दफ़ा ये हुआ था कि वहाँ पे उन्होंने ये लॉ पास किया था कि वाइस चांसलर्स के लिए कोई क्वालिफिकेशन रिक्वायर्ड नहीं है, मैट्रिक की भी ज़रूरत नहीं है, सिर्फ एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव स्किल्स होने चाहिए वगैरह वगैरह। तो जब मैंने ये पढ़ा, यानी कि वो ये बता रहे थे कि जब मैंने ये पढ़ा तो मैंने इमरान खान को मैसेज किया और फिर वहाँ पे एक मीटिंग हुई जहाँ पे पता लगा कि ये वाकई में सच है। फिर मैंने ये ख़त्म करवाया अल्लाह। तो वो ये मुझे ये देने की कोशिश कर रहे थे पिक्चर के केपी में जो वाइस चांसलर्स की जो अपॉइंटमेंट है वो बहुत मेरिट बेस्ड है। अब फॉर एग्जांपल अभी कुछ अरसा पहले आपका एक प्रोग्राम जियो पे था सलीम साफ़ी के साथ, तो वहाँ पे आई थिंक आप भी बात कर रहे थे, सलीम साफ़ी भी बात कर रहा था कि वहाँ पे मिनिस्टर्स अपॉइंट कर देते हैं वाइस चांसलर्स। तो एक्चुअल बात क्या है कि बहुत मेरिट बेस्ड है केपी में या फिर नहीं है बिल्कुल मेरिट बेस्ड?
देखिए, I think the simplest way of looking at it is to see the condition of the universities before 2013 and after 2013. Now, before 2013, you do not find any single instance in which inappropriate. Well, I mean, I can't say this, but you don't find instances where systematically inappropriate people were appointed as vice chancellors. It is true that in some periods, particularly when there was military rule, that senior military officers were appointed as vice chancellors. And some of them did well, some of them did poorly. Unka record jo hai, it's comparable to anything else. But ye kehna कि जी वो मैट्रिक वालों को लगा रहे थे is utter nonsense, because that wasn't happening. After 2013, they changed the law. And the only result of the law is to give Atta-ur-Rehman absolute authority over vice chancellors. एक तो यह है कि he has almost managed to get the provincial government to appoint him as a permanent head of the search committee, and that doesn't seem to be quite right. In fact, when you look at the law, that paragraph seems to have been written by Atta-ur-Rehman himself, because it basically it's couched in a way in which it seems that the purpose is to appoint this particular person rather than to appoint a person who has appropriate integrity and skills. In fact, the integrity वगैरह की तो बात ही नहीं करते. Secondly, what they did was that the committee, I mean, research committees also happen to have a lot of the similar kind of people who could easily be managed. The third thing is that the tenure of the vice chancellor was reduced to 3 years, which means that the vice chancellor never feels secure enough to be able to take any action, because they're always thinking that they have just a few months to go before they end their tenure, and they are beholden to the same search committee for their appointments. With the result now that once in a while, they do end up getting some good vice chancellors. Before they can do anything, if they are any good, their term comes to an end, and then they are not sort of retained. And whereas the ones who are loyalists not only get retained, they keep moving from one university to the other university, and they're permanent. We have also found cases in which vice chancellors were appointed regardless of whether they had the appropriate, even the competencies that were specified in the law, uske bawajud, because there is a lot of data manipulation going on. One ultimate result of that is that the KP universities are now all in a financial crisis, and have, basically are on the verge of bankruptcy, and have to resort to frequent bailouts by the provincial governments, because, even their own, I mean, even though they get more from HEC than they are entitled to on the basis of the HEC's formula, even then they cannot make ends meet. Now that is absolutely a kind of a very clear outcome of this. There are also cases in which, there was one very famous case in which a person who was convicted of plagiarism and whose name had been recommended to the university for the cancellation of his Ph.D. degree was appointed a vice chancellor, and after he completed his term as a vice chancellor, in which there was allegation of various kinds, at the end of that he was appointed to another very lucrative position close to some of the people who are in power. So ये कहना कि जी वो पहले जो है वो गलत लोग कर रहे थे और अब सही लोग कर रहे हैं, that is completely wrong. My last point is that you see, one of the things that was done in 2002 was that the quality of the Ph.D. program was reduced dramatically, with the result that now there's a very large number, including of unemployed Ph.Ds, a very large number of Ph.Ds who do not have the kind of skills that are needed for this purpose, which gives people enormous authority to pick and choose. And that basically means that, if you are a kind of a mafia and you can restrict the pool, inhi logon se lena hai, in logon mein, there are lots of people who don't have the quality, but they have the credentials. So then you can favor them, bring them into your network, promote them, and based on their loyalty to you, use them. So now that kind of a thing is also happening because of the quality of the PhD program. So they are now, this idea, which Atta probably did say to you, only PhDs should be appointed vice-chancellors, comes from that, because that, has become a kind of a constituency from which you can pick and choose the kind of people who will be loyal to. So ye thoda sa problem. But the proof of the pudding is in the eating. There was, the universities were running, let's say they were not bankrupt, they are now bankrupt. And yes, of course, there has been a lot of financial pressure on all universities because this government has been really very bad with providing funding to HEC. But the worst hit are the KP universities. They are in the worst situation.
अच्छा सर, हमने एक और क्वेश्चन में से पूछना लेकिन ये वाइस चांसलर के क्वेश्चन से एक छोटा सा मुझे एक और क्वेश्चन याद आया कि अगर आप पाकिस्तान में फीमेल एकेडमिक्स देखो तो वो ठीक है, उनका क्या कहते हैं रेशियो जो है वो मेल एकेडमिक्स से कम है, लेकिन अभी भी सिग्निफिकेंट रेशियो है। लेकिन आपको लगता है कि फीमेल एकेडमिक्स का कम होना क्या ही वाहिद रीजन है जिसकी वजह से हमें फीमेल वाइस चांसलर्स ऑलमोस्ट बहुत ही कम दिखती हैं, ना होने के बराबर, या कोई और भी रीजन है इसमें आपको लगता है?
तो तीन चीजें हैं। एक तो ये है कि you see, to become a vice chancellor, you do need to have successive appointments of academic administrative positions or other administrative positions in other domains, right? चाहे आप गवर्नमेंट में हो, मिलिट्री में हो, किसी और फील्ड में हो, आपके पास एक proper administrative experience होना चाहिए. If women don't get those opportunities, then it's very difficult for them just to get parachuted into the vice chancellor position. And even when they do get parachuted, it's very risky for them because the pressures are really quite high, and you do need that experience to protect yourself against the pressures. So इस वक्त ये है कि well, I mean, the quality of vice chancellors is varied in any case, but women find it particularly difficult to deal with, all the multitude of the pressures, because they haven't really been given the proper sort of pathway towards becoming vice chancellor. But the second thing also is that if you have there are two kinds of systems. You have a merit-based system in which the best candidate will win, and you have a patron-client system in which basically it will depend upon who you have loyalty to and who do you sort of listen to, etc. And the question then is that in the merit-based system, my own view is that women would have a better chance of succeeding because it's a blind system. It doesn't really look into gender or religion or any of the other matters. But in a patron-client system, I think it would be more difficult for women to move through the ranks, because then they would be exposing themselves to all other kinds of pressures, which perhaps many of them would much rather avoid. So the patron-client system is particularly bad for the weaker segments of society. If you don't come from, kind of a protected group, it's more difficult for you to move forward. So it's what for a long time Pakistan has had this very strongly patron-client system, and I think the KP system is the worst of the lot, because there's really so much rigidity that people have just no choice. So usme bada mushkil hai aage. That's my understanding of the situation. I mean, I'll give you an example. When I took over HEC, and you can look over HEC's record for the last 20 years, this was the first time that we ended up appointing a large number of women to senior positions, right? Grade 21 में or grade 22 में or equivalent में इतनी ज़्यादा औरतें आज तक कभी नहीं लगी थी. मतलब the ratio ended up getting close to when I look at 21 and 22, it was close to 50% of men and women. Now the thing is that it was purely merit based. जो भी best candidate आ जाते थे उनको लगा देते. Now previous dispensation also had the same opportunity. but it was very rare for women to get appointed to these positions. So, obviously, hमें लगता है कि there's some flaw in the system, because of which, in this kind of mafia type arrangements, women find it very difficult to move forward.
Sir,
Yeah,
it's related.
just to clarify that point, when the executive director, I appointed a woman. The head of NAHI, National Academy of Higher Education, it's a grade 22 position. I appointed a woman. The head of the Quality Assurance Agency, which is a grade 21 position, I appointed a woman. The head of the Monitoring and Evaluation System, which is also a grade 21 position, I appointed a woman. This was the first time that so many women got appointed to these people. Now, it just so happened that they were there, but since they were not part of any of those patron-client networks, they could not get appointed. अब जो है एकदम वो आके appoint होना शुरू हो गया. So anyway, sorry.
सर, तो क्राइटेरिया बेस्ड अपॉइंटमेंट्स HEC के अंदर तो नजर आ रही हैं. वाइस चांसलर्स का भी कोई क्राइटेरिया है अपॉइंटमेंट का, एंड देन सब्सिक्वेंटली क्या HEC चेयरपर्सन का भी कोई क्राइटेरिया है कि इतना साल का एक्सपीरियंस होना चाहिए, इतनी पब्लिकेशंस होनी चाहिए? इज देयर एनी मेट्रिक to the appointment of these appointments at higher levels like vice chancellor or HEC chairperson?
देखें, in HEC we changed the human resources policy quite dramatically by emphasizing merit and competency for the first time. And what we found there is that while there was no interest in competency means, can you do this job? There was a kind of a fake emphasis on quality in which numbers were counted for various things without any rationale कि इसके क्यों इतने नंबर है, इसके क्यों इतने नंबर. तो उसमें numbers में कुछ papers के numbers थे, also whether you have served in these positions in various places, again with no relationship to the job that you are supposed to perform. Now, and then there was a very large emphasis on the interview process itself, right? So the numbers you got from the clerical process and the numbers you got from the interview got merged, and interview had a lot of discretion because there were no guidance provided for the interview, right? So, मतलब interview में होता है ना कि how do you give numbers? There was no guidance provided. So for the first time, we sort of put all of those things into the system and said, this is the way we are going to do this. So one of the things we did was that we got rid of the Ph.D. requirement for all but like 2 or 3 positions in the HEC. Why? Because the Ph.D., which is a research degree, is needed only for particular positions, not for every single position. Most of them were either clerical or administrative positions. But then we also found that in a lot of cases, MS and MPhil was required, and there was no logic for it. कि क्यों required? वो भी हमने हटा दी. फिर हमने उनकी competencies देखने की, if you are supposed to do this job, what do you need in order to be able to show that you're successful at it? So we focused a lot. पहले से उनको कैसे shortlist किया जाए और फिर interview में किस किस्म के सवाल पूछे जाए ताकि हम उनको वो करें. When I looked at the vice chancellors, the vice chancellors, there was a so-called criterion, but there was no interest whatsoever in whether the person can do this job effectively. So if you ask, they should have so many papers, the question you need to ask is, why do they need so many papers in order to do this job? Now, what we have tried to do is to say, look, you are an academic institution, you need to have the respect of your peers. If in order to have the respect of your peers, you have to have some prominence in academia, or some record in academia, and papers are one way in which you can prove it. But it's not so much the number of papers, it's actually how well you are recognized in the field, what contributions you have done in the field, etc., which have not been asked until now at all, right? Including by some so-called prominent scientists. Nobody knows unhone kiya kya hai, right? So it just says, I have so many papers, but the thing is, if you are a scientist, you prove something, right? You've contributed something, and nobody can say, yeah, this is what I have contributed. So, so we kind of changed the nature of that discussion. But we also said that in order to do this job properly, you have to have this kind of experience, this kind of experience. You have to demonstrate that you're able to do this. And lastly, we also said that, if you have done some similar jobs, we should be able to go and see whether you were successful with those jobs or whether you were failures. Now, it turns out that most people who had these jobs and kept on getting reappointed had been failures at previous jobs. And they kept on getting reappointed because nobody asked them, aapko ye kaam karna aata hai ki nahi aata. So, so I proposed to the government that aap in cheezon ko change karo. Government's interest was not really very high in those. But they basically, their view was that, or not, I shouldn't say government generally, but some of the people to whom I submitted this idea, their approach seemed to be, how can I appoint the person I want to appoint? And all you do is to provide me with the justification. So then I said, this is not the right way to appoint vice-chancellors and so on. But it seems to me that is exactly what's going on. So they say, listen, here is a person I want to appoint because he or she is my loyalist or will do whatever this thing. Now, I want you to provide me with a justification so that I can defend it. And so if I can come up with some numbers and say, oh, iske number zyada hai, iske number kam hai, then that helps them, right? Because then they can claim that this was done in a kind of quote-unquote kosher manner. So ye problem tha. If you actually base it on merit, you really have no idea whom you're going to appoint. You'll basically look at them in terms of their ability to do the job, and whoever is found to have the best competence for this thing, they gets appointed. So ye masla hai.
So, वैसे हम क्राइटेरिया की बात करें तो एक और पर्टिकुलर क्राइटेरिया के बारे में मैं आपसे क्वेश्चन पूछना चाहता हूँ. अब मैं आपको ये नहीं कह रहा कि आप पूरा फॉर्मूला बैठ के बताएं, लेकिन आप क्वालिटेटिव फीचर्स बताना चाहें अगर, तो वो आप बता सकते हैं. मैं एक क्वेश्चन पूछना चाह रहा हूँ, वो ये है कि हम जो डिस्कशंस हो रही हैं HEC के मुतालिक, उसमें कई दफ़ा हम सुनते हैं कि ना देयर इज़ अ फार्मूला फॉर गिविंग फंडिंग टू यूनिवर्सिटीज. तो आप बता सकते हैं कि इस फार्मूला में किन किन चीज़ों को रखा जाता है ये डिटरमिन करने के लिए कि किस यूनिवर्सिटी को कितनी फंडिंग देनी है? सिर्फ क्वालिटेटिव फीचर्स बता दें अगर आप.
देखिए, the formula at one level was very simple. Let me just explain that it has never been followed because there was total discretion, which is itself a problem to which I will come. But the formula was very simple, which said universities need money based on the number of students they have. The more students you have, the more money you need, right? You need to hire professors, have classrooms, etc. So a significant part of the funding should be based solely on the load, right? The number of students. Now, my view about this is that 80% should have been on the load, but in the event HEC decided 65% on the basis of the load, it's fine. So they also made some egregious errors, which was social sciences, arts and humanities, each student gets like 1 point. Natural sciences, each student gets 2 points, and then engineering and medicine, each student gets 3 points, right? So an engineering or medicine student gets 3 times the funding or the entitlement of a kind of a more liberal arts program. This was not correct. मैंने इसको ठीक किया कि basically हमने उनके costs देखे कि actual cost क्या है उसके basis पे. So there were some cost differences, but they were not as high as this. फिर उन्होंने कहा कि undergraduate के 1 point, masters के 2 points और PhD के 3 points. This was completely ridiculous. The real burden is the undergraduate degree. That's what we want to subsidize.
Yeah.
Because we want everybody to get an undergraduate degree. Masters, MPhil, people should do on their own. There's no need to just subsidize it. You don't even count the MS and MPhil students. PhD programs, my formula was different, that it should be based on the research program that the university has. And the research program should actually include provisions for PhD students, right? So it was a very different approach. So I had shifted it entirely to this undergraduate as a base role. So that was 65%. I wanted to change it, but I said, देखो हर चीज को change मत करो. Then they had 20%, which was called needs-based. And in 20 years, HEC could not come out with any satisfactory formula on what does needs-based mean. Right? There was some hand-waving, कि जी वो distant areas may, if there's a university, then it should have more funding. That's a fair amount of statement, fair statement. But what does that mean? So what we tried to do was, we said, okay, let's link it to the HDI, the Human Development Index indicators, different districts. So, districts which have low HDIs should get more, etc., etc. So we tried to give some structure to it. But other than that, they had no real formula. That was 20% of the funding for which there was no real formula, right? Which means you give the discretion back to the AGs. There also I put in 5% for scholarships. If you give more scholarships, we would refund them up to a cap of 5%. वो हमने पहली दफा किया. Then the third one was performance, and the only performance they counted was the number of papers published, period. Whether you published it in some rag of a journal, or whether you published it in the the Harvard Business Review or something, was completely irrelevant. Number of papers published, you gave them some money. So again, the quality was kind of was not there. There was no mention of teaching. There was no mention of service to the society, etc., etc. So the whole thing was completely lopsided. But the worst thing was that having done all this effort with the formula, they never used it. So the chairman, in his infinite wisdom, decided कि जी इसको give some more money to this, some less money to this. And one of the results was that the vice-chancellors were always knocking on my door with papers saying कि जी we have some financial problems, give us more money. And I would, in the initial days, I would look at them with great surprise, like, where am I going to give you money from? All the money has already been given to you. And then, of course, my staff said, no, you've kept some money for these kind of situations. So I said, no, just distribute the money. The problem really is this. Anyway, I changed it, but the problem really is this. Whether it is HEC or it is the government, if it gives 1 penny to one university and not equitably to the others, it is interfering in the matters of the university. It is undermining the autonomy of the university. It is making the university dependent upon the government. This is now a common practice. HEC has been providing discretionary funds. That means that it has completely left the formula and basically just gives money on the basis of whatever it wants. And government basically comes in and says, let's give some money to the University of Peshawar. Why? Because I like the vice-chancellor's face. I mean, come on. This is interference in the matters of the university. So that's what I said we have to stop. So when I tried to fix it and say, let's go back to the formula, let's make the formula more explicit, let's base it on facts. The result was a lot of areas, there were no facts, so we kind of deleted them, said, okay, now let's fix it. But then the problem was that for the last 20 years, because discretionary funds were being given, University of Peshawar gets twice as much as it is entitled, because the previous people were either listening to them or listening to somebody who was powerful outside of the government and were giving them more money, every year. And they were wasting that money because they're still in a financial crisis. So when I tried to fix it, the result would have been that all of these universities would have become bankrupt, because they were getting more money than they were entitled to, and they were already semi-bankrupt. So I couldn't fix it, but what I did was that I actually created a platform on the basis of which the chairman would have no discretion whatsoever. It would all be done, that the additional amounts would be done on the basis of the formula, and that's how we would proceed. So that's the situation. So I hope you understand that the main problem is the desire to interfere and to get benefits from the university, and that is something that we need to stop.
जैसे वैसे एक छोटा सा साइड क्वेश्चन फंडिंग के हवाले से, वैसे आपने इसके बारे में बात की थी अपने वो जो जियो वाले इंटरव्यू के अंदर, तो एचईसी के जो फंड्स हैं वो फ्रोजन है 64 बिलियन के आसपास. आपको लगता है कि फ्यूचर में इसमें कोई बढ़ने की इसकी उम्मीद है? और आपने कहा था ये रिकरिंग फंड है, जो डेवलपमेंट फंड है वो 30 बिलियन के आसपास है कुछ, तो ये दोनों आपको लगता है कि फ्यूचर में बढ़ने की कोई उम्मीद है, या फिर अभी नहीं है उम्मीद इसकी आपको?
Previous governments did increase them on a kind of a steady basis. As the population increased, as cost increased, as the student body increased, that the recurring grants did continue to increase. Development grants went through cycles. And again, development grants mein hota hai ke, because development grants are more amenable to misuse. So, mafias like development money because they can basically play tricks with it, which they can't really do very much with the recurring grants. So, so when the mafias are powerful, then development grants goes up. When they're weak, then the development grants go down. Ab hamare yahan bhi dekhen, when I took over, the development grants remained more or less the same, about 30 billion. But at the same time, the government promised huge amounts to a private individual on education-related issues, the private individual being Mr. Atta-ur-Rehman. Huge amounts, larger than the amounts which will be provided to all the other universities, or all the universities taken together. If HEC as a whole for development gets 28 or 29 or 30 billion, and to create a PM House university, you're basically demanding 45 billion for just one university. You have 240 universities which have needs, and compared to that, one university is getting more than all of the others put together. It's a scandal. And this kind of scandals have been happening in the past, right? So, this development money is particular money in which people want to put their clause in. But I had proposed, and what I still will propose to the government is, put this into a proper structure. This indiscriminate opening of universities has to stop. We actually calculate, हमने calculate किया हुआ है, roughly about 2 billion rupees for a new university. Let's basically take that as a formula with only minor variations. And then depending on the amount of money that we have, basically move forward on that basis. ये इस वक्त तक यहाँ पे नहीं.
सही. अच्छा सर, एक इससे रिलेटेड क्वेश्चन है. जिनार ने भी क्वेश्चन करना है, लेकिन मैं एक छोटा सा क्वेश्चन कर लूँ इससे रिलेटेड. वो ये है कि क्या कहते हैं, आपको लगता है कि HEC एक बहुत बड़ा इदारा है, राइट? आपको लगता है कि अगर हम ये करें कि जो रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटीज छोटे छोटे इदारों में बांट दें, ताकि किसी एक इदारे के पास इतना ज्यादा पैसा हो ही ना कि माफिया उसमें इंटरेस्टेड हो, तो आपको लगता है ये एक सोल्यूशन हो सकती है, या फिर इसको करना जरूरी नहीं है?
It's a little bit of a balancing of equities. The problem is that if you have too many small things, there is also a much greater scope for corruption, because then you get a lot of petty corruption which goes under the radar, because not everything can be monitored as effectively. HEC mein ye hai ki dekhein, if they were giving us about 65 billion, of which about 50 to 55 was basically just a kind of a accounting number, because it went straight to universities. All that we did, once we calculated which university needs to get what recurring grant, it would automatically go straight to them. So HEC does not really get involved. All it gets involved is to actually define who gets how much. And that then leaves a smaller amount, which is then distributed on the basis of performance, or on the basis of research funding, or yes, here you see the development grant. At this moment, it's a completely chaotic system, right? So people put pressure. They bring their members of the parliament. Government may say, ministers try to come in, and there's no system through which the best use of the money is ensured. HEC we tried to actually oppose it, but then I realized that, as long as we don't have a proper ironclad formula in the first place, let's leave it for the moment as it is, and then once we have the ironclad formula, we'll fight it. I think now, if a new government were to come into power, this is a discussion that we will have with them on day one, and say कि इसको इस तरह से formalize करें. And we hope that they'll be more sympathetic. देखिए, one thing one should not ignore is the fact that last year's crisis has created much greater awareness of all of these challenges, because even with the general public and with the political leaders, whether in the government and opposition, I think they've been sensitized to these issues. So I think we have a much better platform to raise these issues with any new government that comes in.
सर थोड़ी देर पहले हम बात कर रहे थे, थोड़ा सा टॉपिक को डाइग्रेस करें, थोड़ी देर पहले हम बात कर रहे थे वाइस चांसलर्स की अपॉइंटमेंट की, HEC चेयरपर्सन की अपॉइंटमेंट की। सो जो कमेटी बैठती है फॉर एग्जांपल वाइस चांसलर्स के लिए, उस कमेटी में कौन होता है, और क्या वो पहले से कमेटी डिसाइडेड होती है? आई मीन HEC का कोई रिप्रेजेंटेटिव होता है, कोई गवर्नमेंट का रिप्रेजेंटेटिव होता है, या इंटरनली यूनिवर्सिटी खुद डिसाइड कर देती है?
देखिए, माय व्यू इज वेरी क्लियर कि government and HEC should not interfere in internal matters of universities. So my view is that the university should appoint its own vice chancellor. And yes, they should have representatives of HEC. If they want, they can have representatives of government, although I don't think there's any particular need for it. They should have some outside representatives, jisko bhi lena chahiye. So the university should appoint its own vice chancellor. There could be new universities which haven't developed the appropriate mechanism and so forth. So for a certain period of time, let's say for the first 10 years, you could place them under some kind of a central program in which other universities can join in and provide some guidance to them. Lekin government itself should stay away from this. At this moment, it's a very mixed bag system, right? KP, as you know, is controlled by this group that we call it. I think it's doing the worst so far. Sindh has the Sindh Higher Education Commission, and then there's a kind of a search committee which has been appointed. And again, there have been a number of cases in which people have gone to court, so we don't quite know how well it is functioning. But Sindh in recent years has tried to appoint better quality of vice chancellors. So at least in some areas we found something, but it's not universal. All the vice chancellors were not great, but some of them were actually better. Punjab has a bit more of an ad hoc kind of a thing in which the vice chancellors committee basically, just that the search committee, they've kind of tried to follow the KP model in the last 5 years. Usse pehle it was different. But they basically would sort of collect all of the applications and then begin to nominate people or place people in different places. I don't think that, at this moment, that's in a very good shape either. Hopefully that will change in the future. Balochistan makes the governor who would set up the committee. And again, depending upon, how committed or how capable the governor was, you got some good appointments and you also got some bad appointments, right? So that's how it is. Federation May, there was no real process. It was basically an ad hoc system in which the ministry would put together a search committee and then, or a selection board, and then do this thing. And sometimes it worked well, sometimes it worked badly. It was very ad hoc. So at this moment, it's a bit of a mishmash. People have also told me, and I think quite correctly so, that many of the universities are also now controlled by mafias. And if we give it back to the universities, those same mafias would begin to control them. And I'm mindful of that. And therefore, I do feel that the representation of other professional bodies on these selection boards needs to be strengthened. ताकि जरा उसके ऊपर वो रखा जाए. For instance, there's one university here in Islamabad. I went and attended their syndicate meeting, and I was just shocked about the kind of mismanagement, the kind of malgovernance that was taking place. People were being fired for just because they were not loyal. Sort of accusation and of both corruption and other forms of sort of bona fide actions were being pushed under the rug, and all the effort was to basically just insulate the university from any investigative or evaluative processes, and that it's a bit of a problem. So we do need to have some kind of a transition process, but I want us, and I would like, if there is a new government, for them to commit to gradually pulling the government out of this process altogether, so that by the time a new dispensation comes in, we have transferred it back. We now have enough evidence of the malafide in different universities that if we want to take action, we could probably take action. But again, because those people are all interconnected, it has been difficult thus far to do it. But hopefully in the future, it might become easy.
Prerogatives किसका है? HEC का prerogative है या prerogative जो है government का खुद का है या universities?
देखिए, my own view, these are all, देखें इस वक्त पाकिस्तान में और खास तौर पे जब ये माफिया ग्रुप्स होते हैं, when you have this kind of a patron-client network situation, then it's basically a kind of a kabza group mentality. So everybody out trying to capture territory, both physical, वो ज़मीन पे कब्जा करना भी एक बहुत बड़ा हुआ है, लेकिन सबसे बड़ा ये है कि you're trying to capture decision-making powers and privileges, so you can appoint people, etc. So it's all of it is now contested terrain at this moment. So ये नहीं कहा जा सकता कि there's one best practice around these things. But my view on this is very clear. My view is that HEC will not distinguish between a public sector university and a private sector university. So if there is a private sector university which has a board and they appoint a vice-chancellor, we don't tell them, no, we will appoint. So I hold the same rules for the public sector university. If they have a board and they appoint it, I will respect that decision, right? I will not insist that we should do it. In any case, if I look at HEC itself and I look at my staff, the staff has no capacity to appoint even an assistant professor, let alone a vice chancellor. उनके पास कोई capacity नहीं, तो how should I volunteer HEC to do this job? वो नहीं हो सकता. I want the university to make that appointment. But I do want us to play a kind of a corrective role by making it transparent, which means I want to have my representation on the selection board in such a way that if something goes wrong, we have the opportunity to make it transparent, make it public, so that the student community, the professors community can then begin to take notice of it and undertake corrective action.
Sir, कुछ allegations जो है वो recently एक आर्टिकल में हमने देखे, वो HEC चेयरपर्सन की जो तकरीरी होती है उसके ऊपर कुछ एलिगेशंस हैं कि क्या क्राइटेरिया है, किस बेसिस पे होती है, क्या एक्सपीरियंस चाहिए होता है, और आप जैसे होनहार शख्स का वापसी अपॉइंटमेंट क्या पॉसिबिलिटी है और क्या पॉसिबिलिटी है कि माफिया वापस टेक ओवर नहीं कर लेगी? कोई क्राइटेरिया है हमारे पास HEC चेयरपर्सन का या इट्स आल्सो बेस्ड ऑन?
Again, the criteria is very simple. It has to be an academic, an eminent educationist with services in different areas, research, etc. I think the real conflict, wo jo maine kaha na, capturing of terrain, is over the definition of the word eminent. What does eminent mean? Now, one way of doing is to say, ki ji, I basically have that I've asked all my students to put my name on their papers, and when I take all of them together, I have so many papers. Another way of doing it is this is how I have added to the stock of knowledge. Right? These are two different approaches to eminence. My approach is the latter. I also want our professors and our vice chancellors to take this as the right approach and encourage people to focus on this issue. How do you add to the stock of knowledge? But in the past, it has been a very quantitative and anti-quality approach, right? So this has encouraged people. लोग फोर्स करते हैं अपने स्टूडेंट्स को कि आप अपने पेपर्स में मेरा नाम डालें ताकि मेरे नंबर ज्यादा हो जाए. Now that number is meaningless. It's a meaningless number, but that is really what people have been counting on. There are all sorts of other problems. Books were not valued in the past because somehow or the other, the mafia that basically controls this thing, they have essentially specialized in writing short articles. अब वो इस पे भी नहीं insist करते because now they have found some captive presses which publish books which nobody reads, but somehow or the other, that's the thing. So my view is slightly different. My view is that any reasonable academic needs to focus on how do I expand the frontiers of knowledge, how do I make people's lives better, how do I enable us to understand more than what we did before you started working on these things. So these are the things that we should be looking at. Mostly our academic culture has not paid attention to these things. And now we are beginning to shift the burden, the focus a little bit towards this. You as young researchers, I mean, my sort of appeal to you is, focus on how you can contribute, how you can add to the stock of knowledge, even a little bit. Also think of a long-term research program so that by the end of 20 years, you would know where you want to go and how do you want to contribute. That's a different approach than to say कि जी किसी आरे गहरे जर्नल में मैं पर्चा छाप दूं ताकि मेरे नंबर्स पूरे हो जाए. That's not the right approach.
वैसे भी रिनार ने ना कुछ क्या कहते हैं कहा कि कुछ एलिगेशंस हैं, तो मैं कुछ स्पेसिफिक एलिगेशंस की बात करना चाहता हूँ. हमने वैसे नाम लिया तो देखो डॉक्टर अता का नाम दोबारा ले लेते हैं. तो डॉक्टर अता ने फरवरी के एंड में एक आर्टिकल लिखा था द न्यूज में. उसमें आपके ऊपर कुछ एलिगेशंस थे और एचईसी के ऊपर कुछ एलिगेशंस थे. तो उन कुछ स्पेसिफिक एलिगेशंस ऐसे हैं जिसमें मैं जानना चाहता हूँ आपके बारे में. कुछ एलिगेशंस ऐसे हैं जो कि डिमॉन्स्ट्रेबली रॉन्ग है, इतना आसान है देखना कि वो रॉन्ग है. फॉर एग्जाम्पल एक उन्होंने बात ये की कि जब आप एचईसी के चेयरपर्सन बने थे तो आपके सिर्फ 4 पेपर थे. ये बात उन्होंने लिखी हुई है, राइट. इसके अलावा दूसरी बात उन्होंने ये कि आई थिंक उसके बारे में आप जियो वाले इंटरव्यू में कुछ बात कर चुके कि जो यूनिवर्सिटीज हैं वो नई यूनिवर्सिटीज बनाते गए, ठीक है, और एचईसी कुछ भी नहीं कहता था. आपने आई थिंक ये बात कही थी कि हम आपको ये बताया गया था कि इट्स अ पॉलिटिकल थिंग, तो इसमें आप इंटरफेयर ना करें. अगर आपने कुछ और ऐड करना हो तो आप कर सकते हैं. तीसरी चीज ये कि मेरा जितना नॉलेज है, मुझे जितना पता है कि देयर इज अ प्रोग्राम नोन एज IPFP जो कि फ्रेश PhDs की इनटेक करता है. लेकिन उस आर्टिकल में ये भी लिखा हुआ है कि जो फ्रेश PhDs हैं जो फॉरेन से पढ़कर आते हैं, उनकी नॉन एब्जॉर्बेंस जो है ये भी HEC का एक क्या कहते हैं बहुत बड़ी प्रॉब्लम है कि वो उनको एब्जॉर्ब नहीं करती है. तो इन तीनों एलिगेशंस के बारे में आप कुछ कहना चाहेंगे? अगर जिनान ने कुछ ऐड करना तो वो कर सकती है, नहीं तो फिर आप या ओके यू कैन टॉक अबाउट इट.
देखिए जी, let's take the first one. I have a number of papers. I've published books. I have chapters in books. Even in addition to that, I've published policy papers. When I was at the UN, I was doing a lot of policy work. And every single thing has added to the way in which we understand things. 3 areas in particular, sustainable development more generally, and its relationship in particular to climate change. But also the philosophy of knowledge is an area that I have been particularly active in. And then
epistemology या कोई और area?
It's epistemology, but it's the philosophy of knowledge, particularly in economics related fields, right? Okay. Social sciences made philosophy of knowledge. For instance, one of my earliest papers was called Modernization and Its Discontents, in which I basically analyzed development as a way of thinking, right? And what its implications are for both economic change and for political change, right? So development as a way of thinking को मैंने किया था. इसी तरह earlier on my book Economic Liberalization में I focused on trying to look at macroeconomic policy as through the lens of the philosophy of knowledge. Then I had a book called Who Will Save the Forests? And again, the same idea that I approached was, how do people think about forests and what difference does it make the way they think about the forest, right? So it's a slightly different way of approaching the same problem. So, but to come back to it, sustainable development, philosophy of knowledge, and then social justice. Because for me, both sustainable development and philosophy of knowledge are driven by the same idea of justice. And as I said, I've written books, papers, etc., etc. They have techniques of crediting some works and not crediting others, right? तो उस तरह से वो फिर वो 4 का जो नंबर उन्होंने पता ही निकाला है, मुझे नहीं, मेरे साथ नहीं शेयर किया. But in any case, that's neither here nor there. My concern in all of this is that you have to think that here is a challenge that the world needs to know. And can you expand the sphere of knowledge? And every one of those papers that I've written is something that expands the sphere of knowledge. I mean, so once you read it, you understand how this thing is constructed and how do we go forward beyond it. Particularly governance, which is another framework that I've used. Governance I've done a lot of work in trying to bring governance as a way of understanding the nature of social change. Now, that, of course, in the past was not understood, but I think it's a credit to the the search committee that it did pay attention to some of these things. Now, I did not really want to give any more importance to this allegation than it deserves, so I did not really respond to it. Anybody who works in areas of sustainable development, in areas of climate change, knows what I have done, and that's good enough, and they can go up and look at it. But so I think what Atta says is just utter nonsense. And beyond that, I would not take further issue with it. Now, the second thing is the new universities. Again, my view about this is very simple, which is that if somebody wants to set up a university, let them set up a university. So if I don't say something to the private sector, I will not say something to the public sector. But what I did say to the public sector, and I said this explicitly to the Prime Minister, was that if you set up any new universities without giving me any funding, I will not give them any funding, because I will not take money out of an old university in order to pay for one of your sort of new projects, pet projects. So that was a kind of a way of protecting the existing universities from this kind of an onslaught that is taking place. Now, again, in case this government goes, I think we'll have a basis for coming up with a more harmonious decision and discussion on the manner in which universities are to be expanded. But it was something which, on a matter of principle, I said, if the Habib family comes in and says we want to set up a university, I will not stop them. Because I'll say, you set up a university, you run it according to this thing. If, let's say, the government of Punjab says we want to set up a university, my response to them is, by all means, do that, as long as you fulfill my standards, which means you cannot start teaching unless you have so many professors and so much infrastructure, etc., etc. And also that I will not commit any recurring grant resources to you, right? So as long as those two things are understood, you go ahead and do this. And I still stick by that. I think if there's a more reasoned discussion, we'll be able to reach an understanding and clarity quite soon. The last point you raised was about IPFP. This was a kind of a stupid program because it was trying to provide a backdoor for selection. And they had set up a system in which there was a kind of a appointment, let's say, in large numbers without kind of a due process. So, and HEC was basically selecting people and then basically asking the universities to appoint them without kind of the detailed due process, and then say, "Acha, ek saal baad aap dekh." So my view about this is that, number one, this kind of a backdoor is not something that we need to stop. Number two, we need to base it on merit so that it becomes useful for the universities. Number three, we also need to fill any gaps that might exist in our educational program so that people are better equipped in order to deal with this. So what, and the third thing, the last thing is that we don't want this to appear as an alternative to finding a regular academic job, right? So it's basically that, this is, to help you prepare for finding an academic job, right? So, the best way to define it is it's a fellowship, that HEC provides a fellowship, and or a postdoc fellowship. And the purpose of the postdoc fellowship is both to give you experience and to give you some time to prepare yourself for the regular job market, right? That's the idea. We also wanted it to be based on merit. So one of the things we did was to try to assess the quality of different entrants, and we found huge gaps, right? Very fundamental matters that people who have done a PhD should know or should be able to practice were not there, that they had not been exposed to the kind of academic environment that they needed. And that's true because when you start putting people in places where there's no academic community to speak of, they don't learn all of the skills and competencies that they will need. So the first thing is we assess their gaps. Second thing is we provided a training program. And the third thing is that we actually place them as fellows for a limited period so that they could apply for jobs. In the past, the HEC insisted that the university which took them as fellows should hire them. I don't think that is right. The university should always hire the best people. If they do know somebody better, that does give people a slight edge, but it's a slight edge, right? So if they already have an internal candidate, it doesn't mean that an excellent external candidate would have no chance whatsoever. But they know more about the internal candidate, and so they would have an edge. But we don't want this to become a kind of a, as I said, a backdoor to entry into academia. So that was the second. So we have transformed it. It's actually a much better program. It's actually a meaningful program. But more importantly, it has gotten rid of all of the discretionary and favoritism-based elements that existed in the previous program. So wo sab ko humne khatam kar diya. Now, in the future also, I think we are quite insistent on this. And as soon as the current crisis disappears, we will put that back into operation. Right? It's now a very good program. I think it will help people. The one last thing I do want to say is that yes, there has been the cutting of funds to the universities has actually reduced the number of jobs, and by reducing the number of jobs, there has been some unemployment. But I also feel that it's a double-edged sword, that because giving PhDs without the kind of training that PhDs deserve to have, you are forcing them into unemployment. Right? I mean, to give an example, if I'm chairman of HEC and I advertise a position, let's say as director or director general of some division, and I get candidates, some with PhDs, some with masters, some with basic undergraduate degree, I will pick the best person. I will not pick the person who has a piece of paper which has no, kind of a substantive value. I will pick the best person for that job. And that best person might happen to be somebody with an undergraduate, right? Depending on what the position is. For a teaching job, I would prefer somebody with a PhD. But to be honest, if I'm a vice-chancellor and I get a PhD, somebody with a PhD who really doesn't know either the subject or teaching or communications or any of the other skills that we need, and I find an undergraduate or somebody with an undergraduate or a master's degree who does know those things, I will choose the latter. My advice to vice-chancellors and my own philosophy is to always choose the best person. You choose the person who you think is going to succeed in the work that you are going to assign to. And that's a very different approach from just saying, look at the credentials first and then do everything else. That's not the right approach.
सर अभी आपने ये कहा, एक छोटा सा साइड क्वेश्चन है कि आपने कहा कि अब आप वाइस चांसलर को कहेंगे कि चूज द बेस्ट पर्सन, राइट? बट अकॉर्डिंग टू माय अंडरस्टैंडिंग, हो सकता है मेरी अंडरस्टैंडिंग गलत हो, यूनिवर्सिटी में पढ़ाने के लिए डोंट यू नीड अ पीएचडी, अदरवाइज यू कांट टीच इन द यूनिवर्सिटी. क्या ये बात सच है या नहीं?
नहीं, देखिए, there are totally both universities and colleges, we have about 60,000 faculty members. Of those 60,000 faculty members, about 15 to 16,000 have PhDs. So, factually it is incorrect. 3/4 of your faculty does not have a PhD. And out of those 15 or 16,000, about, less than a fourth are what is called the TTS program. And that also is a hugely problematic program. वो भी अपने लोगों को favor करने के लिए बनाया गया. So now we need to rethink many of those, problematic decisions that were taken earlier.
University quality की बात हो रही है, तो I was just thinking about the curricula that is existing. So do you think our curricula represent the context and its nuances that we work in? For example, there's a business degree graduate can set up a business in Pakistan. Does our degree prepare a student for that? What are your thoughts on that?
these were questions that had never been asked. We had a kind of a broken system of curriculum which was kind of discipline based. To her discipline mein, but when I looked at them, I actually felt like throwing up. And these were things that HEC had inflicted on people because A, they were badly written. B, they had no idea what a proper curriculum is. C, they have no idea what textbooks means, and you need to stay up with the literature. You need to advance this thing, choose more sort of recent textbooks, and then you don't just throw a bunch of names at people. You actually structure it in a very very effective way, and then also it was extremely variable in terms of learning outcomes and other elements of the curriculum. But it was focused entirely on disciplines, and all of the broader skills like the practical skills that you talk of were non-existent. Even the general skills were non-existent. So this is why we introduced two new policies, the undergraduate policy and the PhD policy, in order to fix them. I think they realized much later on that this was actually, oh my God, ये तो क्वालिटी की तरफ जा रहा है ना. वो एक कहानी है कि जी वो दो बच्चे किसी से पढ़ते नहीं थे, तो पेरेंट्स बोथ, तो वन टीचर केम एंड सेड कि जी मुझे दे दे, मैं पढ़ा दूंगा. सो ही केम एंड ही टुक आउट सम कैंडीज एंड ही सेड कि मेरे एक हाथ में 6 टॉफियां हैं, दूसरे हाथ में 5 हैं, तो जिसने बता दिया टोटल उसको मैं दे दूंगा. तो एक भाई दूसरे को कहता है मत बताओ, बहाने बहाने पढ़ा रहा है तुमको. So he's using तो उनको समझ आई कि ये बहाने बहाने में पढ़ा रहा था. तो उनको फिर उन्होंने अपोज करना शुरू किया, and they got a few of their फालतू VCs to oppose it. Hopefully उसको भी हमने वो कर दिया. उसमें we structured it properly. One, the matter that you raised, which I would have normally said at the end, is that we put in the practical learning requirements as a part of the curriculum. And we made it an uncredited but mandatory part of the curriculum. And that includes internship programs in order for them to get exposure of the job market. That included an entrepreneurial lab, and again with time requirements so that people, those who wish to do this can actually go into the entrepreneurial lab and something. We also said KG sports could be counted as one of the things that you do in the practical work. We also included clubs and social associations, because all of these things people need to learn from their environment. So that we put in, and we put in a kind of proper structure for it. We also put in a proper framework for general education. That means everybody who has a degree in Pakistan should have a foundation of essential academic skills, including how what are the questions, how to search, how to look for questions, communications, literacy, numeracy, knowledge of the broad sweep of human knowledge. I mean, ये सारी चीजें हमने उसमें डाली, उसको भी properly structured थी. Now, of course, people have tried to oppose it, but they benefited by the fact that a lot of people hadn't read it. Anybody who read it understood that this is what was needed, and this is going to provide the next step that we need. But be that as it may, a few people still oppose it, but I think they're kind of doing so mindlessly. इसी तरह हमने PhD program भी change किया, because PhD program really is the equivalent of the Federal Public Service Commission or the ISSB. It is the way in which we recruit our colleagues. And if we have a weak PhD program, if we admit anybody who happens to sort of find some time on their hands, we give them an indifferent education, unke aane ki bhi zarurat nahi hai, etc. And then we basically give a degree to anybody who takes the trouble of signing up. We are destroying academia. So what I wanted to do was to raise the bar for the PhD program and treat it as a proper selection process, right? This is the way you select, you choose your colleagues in the future, right? तो उसको उसी तरह से हमने कहा, उसमें mentoring की requirement, उसमें वो दूसरे जो अपना exams की requirement, उस सबको हमने transform किया. And one of the things I said is this nonsense about you can only apply if you have an MS or MPhil. This nonsense should be done away with. Basically, you're trying to find the best candidates and you bring them into the system. MS MPhil में जो आपका time requirement था, वो PhD में डालते हैं ताकि वो पूरा एक ही time में complete कर सकें. Again, there have been lots of irrelevant comments on that, but they are, really nonsensical.
सर, तो आपने कहा कि ये पॉलिसी आपने कंस्ट्रक्ट कर लिया है, एंड इसकी इम्प्लीमेंटेशन और अकाउंटेबिलिटी के क्या मैकेनिज्म्स हैं, और आर दे इन प्लेस? व्हेन विल इट बी इम्प्लीमेंटेड? व्हेन विल, फॉर एग्जांपल, अ बिजनेस ग्रेजुएट वुड एक्चुअली बी एबल टू स्टार्ट द बिजनेस?
देखिए, the thing is that a year ago, or maybe towards the end of 2020, this had been finalized and it was being rolled out. तो पहले तो जब ये माफिया ने, जब इनको कुछ और नहीं मिला, the mafia actually did a lot against me, right? They filed cases against me. They, tried to get the government to harass me, and the government harassed me in an innumerable number of ways. When nothing worked, फिर उन्होंने इस तरह से शुरू किया कि इन चीजों को oppose करते हैं, right? As if, that they are my babies, and if they attack them, then maybe I will back off and do their bidding. तो उसके बाद इन्होंने इनको harass करना शुरू किया, and they found a few, I call them amenable vice-chancellors. उनको, it's only a handful. उनको इन्होंने mobilize किया, stage manage things, etc., to push that process forward. So for the last 1 year, it's been in a bit of a doldrums, and people were fighting a kind of a rear guard action to protect them. Abhi tak wo, because the position is not entirely clear, it's still a little bit unclear. But, again, in the next week or so, we'll turn the corner on that, and then we will push this process further. At this moment, the best universities seem to be buying into it. The weaker universities, or universities which are otherwise good, but do happen to have rather weak vice-chancellors, they are kind of being hesitant. But we'll move forward.
When we talk about the good universities, some of the private universities come to my mind, and they have started now thinking about online education. How do you see their online courses quality, and how do you ensure, are there any mechanisms? What benefits and risks do you see in that? And also, we know that market forces, if they're in online arena, they're competing with MIT and Harvard because they have edX and other Coursera courses that they're competing with. So apart from market forces, what are other quality mechanisms that are in place to assure the quality?
Yeah, so you see, the thing is that we have to kind of turn this around. I mean, again, it's the philosophy of knowledge. The first thing is that constructing a good, decent virtual course, or one syllabus, is a good idea. It gives people experience. It also exposes people to other technological skills, both students and faculty members, and we think it's a good idea. Up to a certain percentage, it can get done. The problem is that Pakistan has not had a history of producing good courses, and we also had, in our undergraduate policy, we also had proposed to develop some online courses which universities which did not have the capacity could use as an alternative. But if they had the alternative themselves, then they would stick to that. But it was an option that they could use. But we felt that there has to be a kind of an upper cap on the sort of the number of online courses that you take as a requirement for a degree, right? Because all of this has to do with how much do you allow different things to move forward. Now, what we found is that in the past, when online or whatever, distance learning, not online, distance learning was allowed, a lot of fraudulent programs came up, and some universities and some individuals made a lot of money by basically giving spurious instruction to students, and we didn't want that to happen. So we set up appropriate, guidelines about how this could be done. We also put an upper cap on this. The third thing is that distance degrees has to be, say, a distance degree, right? For instance, if two CVs come before me, I will not give the same importance to a degree which is totally online than I would to give a degree which is sort of largely in person, right? Because no matter what people say, there are fundamental differences in quality there. So if it is more than a certain amount, it has to say this was an online degree, so that the employer or whoever it is would know, how much weight to put on it. ये पुराने ज़माने में private होता था कि people who took a private exam, everybody would know कि इस पे weight कम आपने देना है, because people don't have a lot of other experience. So that was one issue कि उसके ऊपर safeguard लगाने. So we constructed some safeguards partly out of the experience with COVID. The other thing is that this online kind of drive currently, and certainly for the mafias, because people can make a lot of money through this, right? Because it reduces your costs, and you can start collecting money from people who end up getting degrees without having the education that they need. So, but that is in part because people really did not try to understand what the entire education means, what education means, what the substance is, and what the university experience is trying to provide. Because the university experience does not only provide you with somebody giving you instructions in optics 1 or optics 2 or something. It also gives you a community of knowledge in which you learn from each other. It gives you libraries, and you have to learn how to use libraries. It gives you a kind of an ability to question and to understand different things. It gives you the ability to work with other people. It also gives you an understanding of kind of how do you interact in the social environment, in a social academic environment. So ये सारी चीजें उसमें environment में से आती हैं. The most important part of it is that the university gives an opportunity for people to interact on a sustained basis with people who are bright, who are professional, who are committed to certain academic goals, right? It puts you in that context. In many ways, it's like Alice in Wonderland. You go through the rabbit hole and you're in a completely different world, and you're trying to learn the rules of the game from this, and the university environment is supposed to give you. ये जो ऑनलाइन कोर्सेज में, इसमें वो सारी चीजें गायब हो जाती हैं, और गायब नहीं हो, डाइल्यूट हो जाती हैं, और कई चीजें तो बिल्कुल ही गायब हो जाती हैं. So we don't want people to think that the entire purpose of education is that you have a little bit of a syllabus, and somehow or the other you get some student to say कि अच्छा ये syllabus है, or by the way, this is what these things mean. That's not what it is. It's actually a proper engagement. So I didn't want us to start thinking that we can do this second-rate stuff and call it education. I also didn't want people to continue to persist with the myth that it is the degree that is important and not the education. I actually wanted people to put the emphasis where it belongs, namely education. What have you learned? What do you know? What can you do? Can you work with other? What are your interpersonal skills? Can you work with other people? What kind of a networking system do you have? ये सारी चीजें आपने सीखने की जरूरत होती है. So, and these are the things that the university should emphasize. तो ये सारी वो खत्म. तो इस वक्त मुझे जो लगता है ये discussion शुरू हुई है. It's a kind of a ass backwards discussion, because they are actually not looking at what the academic endeavor is. They're just looking at, oh, we can make some money from this, and can you help us make money? And my answer is, no, I'm not going to help you make money. If you do a good job, you'll make money. It will come by the side anyway. You do a good job, and we will keep this door open for you.
While talking of the good job, so faculty, as we know, do their PhDs, but not necessarily have their training in teaching and designing courses. So do HEC have any mechanism for faculty development in teaching and training, and what are the recent initiatives on that?
We started the National Academy of Higher Education. I got some very good people to come in and provide instructions and build the capacity. It's not rocket science. Anybody can go on the internet and get that information. The problem is people didn't. HEC also used to run programs, but the people who gave instructions were actually worse than anybody I have seen. वो उन्होंने अपने favorites रखे हुए थे, वो आके instructions देते थे. People who would come and learn, they went away worse than where they had started, because they thought this is good teaching. That wasn't good teaching. So we actually got some good people there. We started those programs. But at the end of the day, I think that I felt that this was a way of creating a model which the universities should adopt. The ultimate goal, they can, you see, let me explain my sort of entire philosophy. My philosophy is that if the university is not interested in quality education or research, it will not happen. And so far, by actually treating the university as a child and allowing the kind of criminality and so forth to function over there, we have deterred the university from, moving in the right direction. So I would basically want to say, let me give you an example, but this is your responsibility. You have to do this. If you don't feel committed to it, if the Vice-chancellor, and many of the Vice-chancellors that I see are not committed to quality. I mean, they basically are doing their job and they want to earn their benefits and so forth. So including some of the so-called very large and very prominent universities, unke Vice-chancellor is kabil hi nahi. So if they are not committed, it's not going to happen. So if they were committed, if I were, or had served as a Vice-chancellor, I would have set up a faculty capacity building program in the university itself. And I would have gotten some best people to come and do it on a systematic basis. I would have created these communities of learning so that people learn from each other. I would have created a number of other practices which enable people to move in this direction. So humne NAHI ke through we have created a national body, but the real purpose of this body is to replicate itself at provincial and also at the institutional levels. But we have provided a model already.
ठीक. अच्छा सर, एक ना करेक्ट मी इफ आई एम रॉन्ग, आई थिंक एक लोन था कोई वर्ल्ड बैंक का $400 मिलियन का, और मुझे याद है कि जब आप डॉक्टर खुद भाई से बात कर रहे थे बिल्कुल स्टार्ट में जब ये शुरू हुआ था सब कुछ, तो आपने कहा था कि शायद वो लोन भी अब कैंसिल हो जाए. तो उस लोन का क्या बना, वो कैंसिल हो गया या फिर अभी भी वो दे रहे हैं?
नहीं, वो दे तो रहे हैं, but they are very unhappy because the last year has been wasted. So I mean, you see what happened last year when I was away, anything in which some people had a personal financial interest started moving very fast. Project got approved, money started sort of coming out. Anything in which people did not have a personal financial interest got put on the back burner or was not addressed. And in particular things which had to do with quality and so forth, usko जानबूझ के खराब करने की कोशिश की गई, right? क्योंकि they were, I think it was against their philosophy as well. So this project became a little bit of a tool in that game. So people were not hired. Some of the good people were let go or fired or harassed. जो sort of projects में वो थे जो procurement करनी थी, procurement नहीं हुई. In some cases, sort of very poor recruitment was done. I mean, so there were lots of problems that happened last year. Even in the last two months since I've been reinstated, it's the same thing has continued. So अभी तक एक किस्म का वो strangle हो गया. And as I said, उसमें जो worst problems थे उनको तो मैंने fix कर दिया, but I really need to get this mafia out before I can save that program. World Bank बार-बार मुझे complain कर रहा है कि भाई आप कुछ करें इसके बारे में. And I have assured them that once these things get resolved, we will move forward.
ठीक. अच्छा सर, क्या कहते हैं, लास्ट 3 क्वेश्चंस अब हमारे हैं. एक क्वेश्चन जो मेरा है वो ये है, वो ना एक स्पेसिफिक इंस्टीट्यूट के बारे में है. सो लाहौर में आपको पता होगा एक ना इंस्टीट्यूट है, उसका नाम है ITU, इंफॉर्मेशन टेक्नोलॉजी यूनिवर्सिटी. सो वो नून लीग के दौर में बनी थी. उसमें डॉक्टर उमर सैफ को वाइस चांसलर लगाया गया था. इट वाज अ वेरी गुड यूनिवर्सिटी, राइट. मेरे ब्रदर ने वहां से बैचलर्स किया था. इट वाज अ वेरी गुड यूनिवर्सिटी. तो ये जो PTI की गवर्नमेंट में मुझे डिटेल्स नहीं पता, लेकिन हुआ कुछ यूं कि डॉक्टर उमर सैफ को छोड़ के जाना पड़ा था उसके बाद वहां से. तो उसके बारे में कोई HEC स्पेसिफिक प्लान्स हैं कि वहां पे, क्योंकि अभी जो वहां पे वाइस चांसलर हैं और जो वहां पे एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन है, इट्स नॉट दैट गुड, राइट. तो उसके बारे में कोई HEC का प्लान था कि उसका क्या करेंगे अगर आपको और टाइम मिला, क्या कहते हैं HEC के अंदर?
Yeah, I'll take a look at it. As you know, I would much rather that the government not, you cannot ensure that there will always be a good government in Pakistan. So, and these kind of episodes will happen, that, people will make bad decisions. They should not come into the educational sphere. We should keep them out of the educational sphere. So my preference, of course, is that the university should be empowered to make good decisions itself. And if anything needs to be done, either in the form of capacity building, or in the form of strengthening the rules, or in the form of participation by HEC representatives, that thing needs to be done. लेकिन ultimately वही करें. तो इस approach के साथ I think कि ITU को भी हम fix कर सकते हैं. लेकिन I don't want to sort of think of this कि जी government को replace करके HEC को ले आए, and we cannot guarantee that if this government continues in power, that they would appoint a good chair. In fact, the likelihood, if this government continues in power, is that somebody from that mafia would get appointed. And that, of course, would be very unfortunate. So we don't want to create that thing. We want to actually insulate the universities from these unnecessary pressures. So hopefully we'll take some actions which will move us in that direction.
We talked about the role of university in general, but I'm also and the autonomy that universities, administration, and faculty has. I'm also interested in learning more about students' autonomy, and how can students be best engaged in improving the quality of universities? What can they do? What are HEC's efforts to mobilize student bodies and back into action?
You see, so one project that I started, I don't currently have the resources, and maybe we'll ask for a volunteer effort from some of our advanced students, both who are in Pakistan or elsewhere, to milke kare. One project I started was a kind of a student handbook. All the students' rights and responsibilities ताकि हम वो कर लें. इसके साथ मेरा जो एक वो भी था, which has now happened in one province, was that student unions ought to be restored. Because that is one way in which those things can get expressed, but it also needs to come in as part of the rights and responsibilities of students. You see, part of the problem is that both for faculty and for students, there is a kind of or at least I, as an academic, always I feel that there are some sort of rules of conduct to which I try to adhere. So if I talk to you about people, if I talk about this thing, about an argument, if I, behave with my colleagues or my staff, there's this particular way of conducting oneself, which is appropriate for an academic. And I think over the last 20 years, that code of conduct and that kind of a ideal form of behavior has been thoroughly destroyed. And it has been replaced with this kind of a, mafia type culture, which is not appropriate either for students or for faculty members. With the result that once people understand that in this kind of an environment, then they try to sort of, if they think that, if you bring about the unions, then all hell will break loose. So they, instead of actually correcting what needs to be corrected, they try to come up with some superficial remedies, right? If your shoe doesn't fit, you don't cut off your foot, right? You change your shoe. So when the shoe doesn't fit, they try to cut off the foot, right? कि unions ही नहीं होनी चाहिए यार, वो जो आपका conduct है उस चीज को उसकी तरफ जाए. तो इसीलिए student handbook and faculty handbook as two of my agenda items. I try to start work on them internally. Then I try to get the faculty associations and student groups to respond. वो कोई भी इसमें interest नहीं ले रहा. So now we need to find an alternative way of actually doing a kind of a crowdsourcing of something like this, so that we come up with both a code of conduct, a charter of responsibilities, and a charter of sort of obligations. तो वो हम build करके students के लिए करें. और ये, but it's also necessary for faculty. I mean, faculty also needs to feel that, we are actually setting an example for our younger colleagues, and that's why it's important for us to have a code of conduct.
अच्छा सर, वैसे क्या कहते हैं, मेरा एक लास्ट क्वेश्चन था, लेकिन क्या कहते हैं, इस क्वेश्चन से एक छोटा सा साइड क्वेश्चन हम आप एड्रेस करते हैं, फिर हम लास्ट क्वेश्चन पूछ के खत्म करते हैं. ये भी आपने जो स्टूडेंट बॉडीज की बात की है, इस पे जो क्या कहते हैं सबसे बड़ा क्रिटिसिज्म आता है वो ये है कि स्टूडेंट बॉडीज जो हैं ये वायलेंस पे उतर आती हैं, वायलेंस करती हैं। लेकिन एक मेरी ऑब्जर्वेशन है, आप मुझे बता सकते हैं कि क्या आपकी ऑब्जर्वेशन, क्या आपको लगता है कि ऑब्जर्वेशन सही है कि नहीं, कि जो स्टूडेंट बॉडीज वायलेंस करती हैं उनका ताल्लुक किसी पॉलिटिकल पार्टी से होता है, उसके अलावा जो स्टूडेंट बॉडीज होती हैं वो ऐसे जितना वायलेंस नहीं करती हैं? तो आपको लगता है कि ये बात सही है या नहीं?
यार देखें, let us take it back to what the real issue is. The real issue is that if somebody does something wrong and is not held accountable, it's an incentive for them to keep on doing something wrong. If people are held accountable, then that's an incentive for you to amend your behavior. Now, if there are people in the country, either in the government or otherwise powerful mafias, who can protect people even when they do something egregiously wrong, then you will get kind of a sustained degeneration. If there are, rules of how to conduct oneself, then you begin to see an improvement. हमने ये भी देखा है कि good vice-chancellors have been able to turn things around because they provide justice, they're impartial, they set a good example for everybody. People know that they can sort of prosper in that thing and also improve their quality. तो अगर आपने weak vice-chancellors लगाए हुए हैं, incompetent or corrupt, इस वक्त तो कई ऐसे who are well known to be corrupt vice-chancellors. When you do that, then you cannot control these things because all of them will become party. So it's this thing. But मेरा अपना point यही है कि देखें, don't fix the wrong thing. Fix the thing which needs to be fixed. So, just say कि जी student association नहीं होनी चाहिए. वो इसलिए कि ये दूसरे criminal elements, including some of your vice chancellors, including some of the people who are appointing the vice chancellors, that some of them are going to take the law in their own hands. That's not the right thing. उस दूसरी चीजों को आप फिक्स करें.
ठीक है सर, लास्ट क्वेश्चन ये है, अच्छा ये इस क्वेश्चन की ना एक फॉर्म हमने भी थोड़ी देर पहले डिस्कस की थी, लेकिन मैं क्वेश्चन दोबारा इसलिए पूछ रहा हूँ क्योंकि ना ये जो मैं एक सजेशन के बारे में इसमें पूछना चाह रहा हूँ, उसके ना कुछ मैनिफेस्टेशन हैं हमारे मुल्क के अंदर। तो अभी हमने थोड़ी देर पहले बात की थी, बल्कि काफी देर पहले, कि क्या हमें एचईसी को की रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटीज को छोटे छोटे इदारों में बांटना चाहिए कि नहीं। लेकिन अब ये जो मैं बात करना चाह रहा हूँ वो ये है कि अगर हम सिर्फ ये बात करें कि क्या जो वो जो इदारे हैं जो कि पॉलिसी बनाते हैं और वो जो रेगुलेट करते हैं, क्या उनको डिफरेंट होना चाहिए कि नहीं, क्योंकि आई थिंक कुछ हद तक ये स्ट्रक्चर मेडिसिन और इंजीनियरिंग में मौजूद है। तो आपको लगता है कि ये करना चाहिए या फिर ये भी प्रॉब्लम, जैसे आपने कहा था कि अगर आप छोटे इदारे बनाएंगे तो उसमें करप्शन ज्यादा हो जाती है, तो आपको लगता है कि यहाँ पे भी ये हो सकता है या नहीं?
देखिए, the ultimate goal for HEC is to stand as a kind of a bulwark against interference or in academic matters. In the past, it did not do so. In fact, it was the midwife through which these interference came in. क्योंकि वो हर किस्म की interference पहले वो लोगों के लगाने में भी, पैसों के distribution में भी. So the more it can become that bulwark, then it can actually protect the educational sphere. Now, for that, it does need a certain amount of gravitas. And so, I don't think there's anything wrong with the powers that are currently assigned to it. I do think that, some of the details, जैसे कि अगर engineering के curriculum में, if PEC is doing a good job, let it do it. We will basically take it on board. But if PEC, Pakistan Engineering Council, stops doing a good job, then HEC will step in and say कि हम आपको फिर force करेंगे, right? So you're actually a means of, that you can delegate some authority as long as it is exercised properly. But at the end of the day, the real thing we need to do is to protect it, set standards, provide guidance, build capacity. इन सारी चीज़ों पे कोई compromise नहीं हो सकता. कुछ चीज़ें ऐसी हो सकती हैं कि वो हम hand off कर देंगे किसी को for the time being, but keep an eye on it until, and if there are problems, then you step in again.
Thank you so much, sir, for your time and insightful discussion. I'm happy to contribute to the student handbook part if you would like to have volunteers. And we can work online however way in your guidance and work for our country in the best ways we can.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir,
Thank you.
so much. Thank you for your time.
Thank
I hope कि अगर कभी दोबारा हमें क्या कहते हैं आपने टाइम दिया तो हम जरूर आपके दोबारा बात करना चाहेंगे और डिफरेंट टॉपिक्स के ऊपर. So हमने काफी टाइम ले लिया आपका, लेकिन thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very kind.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.